Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Today, we will introduce the concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods. We'll be hearing from advocates of the idea, as well as giving you the chance to ask questions about how a 20-minute neighbourhood might work in practice. Good morning, my name is Emma Scott, and I am the Operations Manager at Disability Equality Scotland. I'm joined today by my colleague Ali Bruce, who is helping to facilitate today's session from behind the scenes. But let me take a few minutes, first of all, just to run through how today's session will work and how you can interact with us. At any time during today's webinar, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's speakers. To do so, just type your question into the Q&A box in the bottom control panel. Please use the Q&A rather than the chat function. And as time allows, the panel will address as many questions as they can during the Q&A session. If you prefer, you can ask a panelist a question directly. Please say so in the Q&A box and then we can select you to speak. At this point, you'll have to manually unmute yourself to be heard. But any questions submitted today that we don't get the chance to respond to during the session, we'll get a response and we'll circulate that afterwards. If you're having any technical difficulties using Zoom today, then please put your issue into the chat box and Ali will do his best to resolve that for you. Now, we do have communication support with us today. We have live captioning provided. So if you'd like to view the captioning for today's session, then please click the button that says closed caption in the bottom control panel and they'll appear on your screen. But we'll also pop a link to a streamtext.net into the chat if you do prefer your captions to be on a separate screen. We're also joined today by BSL interpreters. We have Stephen and Neve with us. Thanks for coming. Today's session will be recorded, so we will share the link after today's session, and you'll also receive a very short evaluation survey. So please do take the time to give us your feedback, as it does help us to plan for future webinars. So that covers all of our housekeeping, first of all, but let me now turn our attention to the topic of 20-minute neighbourhoods. So to set today in context, the Scottish Government recently launched its programme for government, which included a commitment to support the aspiration of a 20-minute neighbourhood. Now, our panel will describe this in much more detail as we go through this morning, but essentially a 20-minute neighbourhood is where all your basic needs, shops, health, work opportunities and recreation are within a mile or so of your home and close enough to access by walking or wheeling. Disability Equality Scotland are working with Transport Scotland to hear from disabled people about their views on the idea of a 20-minute neighbourhood. We're very interested in your concerns, any potential challenges, but also about the potential benefits of such an idea and a concept. As usual, to inform today's discussion, we put round one of our weekly polls. And we are asking for feedback on the idea of a 20-minute neighbourhood, and some of those views will help inform our discussions today. But let me start today by introducing our panellists. We're joined by Irene Buteman, Planning for Place Programme Manager at the Improvement Service, David Cowan, Head of the Regeneration Unit, Scottish Government Social Justice and Regeneration Division. We have Rona Arthur, Interim Head of Service, Connected Communities at North Ayrshire Council. We have Kevin Murray, Professor of Planning at Dundee and Glasgow Universities. David Hunter, who's representing the Mobility and Access Committee for Scotland. And our very own Morven Brooks, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Disability Equality Scotland. Thanks everybody, welcome, and thank you for your time this morning. We will spend a bit of time going through and hearing from each of our panellists. So we will get an introduction to the 20-minute neighbourhood concept. We'll hear what the Scottish Government are doing, as well as how things work in practice with some case studies from North Ayrshire. And then we'll hear about the impacts, particularly the impact on disabled people. As I said, there will be the opportunity for questions as we go along today, and I will aim for a comfort break around 11:20. So let's get started. Why don't I hand over first of all to Irene Buteman, who will talk about the 20-minute neighbourhood concept. Irene, over to you.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join you all today to have a conversation about something that I'm certainly doing a lot of work around. I'm trying to talk and share my screen, which is that double task that's a challenge at times. There we go, that should work. So as Emma explained, I work for the Improvement Service and also for Public Health Scotland. And the Improvement Service is an organisation that works to help local government and their stakeholders to deliver our national performance priorities for the whole of Scotland. So I work on place, and a 20-minute neighbourhood, therefore, and the ambition from Scottish Government that Emma was just referring to is an important aspect of place, because any neighbourhood is a place. So today, I would just like to spend a little bit of time giving an overall context of what a 20-minute neighbourhood is. Where are we with this in Scotland? And then I'll hand over to the other panellists that are discussing, who will take you on more of the journey. But given that some may not be aware of what it entails, I'll just spend some time giving us everybody that same context and foundation as a basis for our conversation moving forward. So I'll begin by actually looking about what a place is. We speak an awful lot within local government, national government, about place and about working together in a place. I'll cover very quickly why we do that and why that matters, and then get into the meat of the fact that a 20-minute neighbourhood is all about working together in a place, and a little bit of context of what's happening across the world, and then moving forward in Scotland also. So what's important thinking about any neighbourhood, any area out with your own window at the moment, you'll be looking out on a place, and that will be very different depending on where you are. There is, as we would know, no one place that is the same, no one street, no one town, no one part of Scotland, indeed no one country across the whole of the world. It exists at all levels, and they all have very, very many different characteristics. What's important is that there are three overlying characteristics always there in a place, and that feeds in to looking at these 20-minute neighbourhoods and how we move forward with them. So what they are is that every place has the physical aspect of it. It's the planet, but it's also pavements, fields, streets, town centres. It has that physical built aspect, or that physical natural aspect, be that urban or rural. We also always have the people, the communities, the cultures, and that again varies from city to city, from country to country, and also within cities and neighbourhoods. And within neighbourhoods, we have very different people. There is never one community. We have such varying people, and their needs are different as well. And then we also always have an economy there. Now that can be our jobs, but that can also be investment. And by that, I don't just mean businesses, I mean our own investment. Wherever we're watching this, we're sitting in a building that is being paid for by somebody, be that a coffee shop, our home, whatever. Somebody has invested, renting it or buying it. We've invested. We walk out onto a pavement, we look at a farmer's field, there's investment and there's impact there. So the work that I do about place is about the fact that we need to work together to make sure that when we go and make a change in, say, a physical environment, that we think before we do that about the impact that it's going to have on all of the people and on all of the aspects of that economy as well. We can end up going in with the very best of intentions and not meaning to actually cause unintended consequences that can be very damaging for others and for the economy, for the physical place, or for those people, without meaning to do it. There's a quote that I feel captures this very clearly. I'll read it out. Obesity, inactivity, depression, and loss of community has not happened to us. Rather, we legislated, subsidised, and planned it. Now, what that means is that those going in and planning interventions that led to those poorer outcomes did not mean to. They were going in with the very best of intentions in one area of the place without giving full enough consideration on the impact it would have in other areas. And so without meaning to, led to us having a situation now where those are the things that are happening across Scotland, and those are the things that are contributing to the inequalities that we have across Scotland as well. So we need to think before we act, and we need to not sit in our own silo doing our own bit of work, knowing that we're doing it for the very best of intentions. We need to think about what others are doing and how that will impact. So that very much takes us into what the ambition behind a 20-minute neighbourhood is. It, as Emma said, came into the programme for government. So it is Scottish Government saying this is a priority for us moving forward. And having come in, it then did get a lot of attention. It's not necessarily new. It's, as you can see, it's happening across the world. But it isn't a new idea, but getting it into the programme for government means that it is seen as now being much more important. So many more people are thinking about it and talking about it. In Melbourne and Portland, they are moving forward with 20-minute neighbourhoods. You may have heard of Paris and its 15-minute city. We have Copenhagen with a 5-minute radius that is their ambition. We have Barcelona looking at super blocks where people are living. As you can see, the variation in those minutes varies over the world. And I think the important aspect is the people. We can't be expecting a time on what living locally means. We have such a variety of people in our country that we need to be thinking of all of those and how they access different services and amenities. Not just your 20-year-old who's in full health and able to walk at a certain pace. We need to be thinking about those who are wheeling, those who are pushing prams, have children in tow, and our growing ageing population as well. So it's important to think more about that than to think about a number of minutes. So for myself, I would agree with what Emma was saying. We're talking about access to daily services and amenities without needing to get into a car in order to do that, to live locally and to reduce that reliance on cars in order to get to our daily services and amenities. And I do have to emphasise that we're not talking about putting up walls around neighbourhoods saying you should get everything you need here. It is daily that we're referring to. What's coming out very clearly from Scottish Government is that the ambition for a 20-minute neighbourhood and that emphasis on living more locally and reducing our need to travel is going to have the potential to deal with our emissions, with the damage that we're doing to the planet if we use cars less, and also to improve our health and well-being. If we have people out and moving about more and not using a car when they don't need to, then they can be not just more physically active, but it's also that impact on their mental health, their contact with nature, their social contact with others that you achieve far more than when you're moving around in a metal box. The ambition in Scotland then with 20-minute neighbourhoods is that we explore that now. We are at the beginning of a journey. How do we get a new emphasis on living more locally, and how do we get that within all of Scotland? So that's our remote rural communities as well as our towns and cities. And how do we take account of the needs of everyone in society? so that it is equality that we're building in from the very beginning of delivering on these 20-minute neighbourhoods. What do we mean? What do we think are the things we need within a 20-minute neighbourhood? Well, that is set out in Melbourne, and they run through a list of items. They look at local shopping, health facilities, schools, learning opportunities, playgrounds, parks, green space, community gardens, sport, safe streets, affordable housing, the ability to age in a place and not have to move to another area when you wish to downsize or need a change of housing type. A mix of housing types as well. A walkability, the ability to walk from places to places without needing to get into a car. Safe cycling, local public transport, local employment opportunities, but also an acceptance that we need to be well connected to public transport so that we have access to jobs and other services that aren't within our daily needs, but we can still access them through public transport as well. So that is the aspiration that certainly Melbourne have identified. What about Scotland? Well, as I say, we're on the beginning of a journey. But Scotland, for a number of years now, has had a tool called the Place Standard Tool that asks a conversation. If you're thinking about a place immediately outside your door, in your town, in your region, or in your country, there are 14 areas it suggests that you should think about to make sure that you're thinking about all of a place. And it very much matches across with those topics that I've just listed that Melbourne are looking at. It is looking about how you move around, public transport, traffic and parking, streets and spaces, natural space, play and recreation, facilities and amenities, work and local economy, housing and community, social contact, identity and belonging, feeling safe, care and maintenance, and influence and sense of control. Behind that tool are a set of ambitions, really, for delivering those in every part of Scotland. So certainly for myself, as we begin this journey in Scotland, we're very fortunate to already have a set of themes that we've been using and that we can look to as a foundation. But there will be many other ideas on our foundation, and our other panellists may well have other things to suggest. These are the foundations I've certainly been working around because they very much emulate what others are doing and feeling and have practice and learning on what that 20-minute ambition for living locally should be. What is important, if we look at those different themes that sit, be that in Melbourne or that Scottish context, is that we track that back to what different people in our society and in our country need. So if we look at the very first one around moving around and saying that what we want is that it's easy to move around local areas using good quality routes for walking, for cycling, for wheeling. We can't simply make a judgment on that one-off. We need to cross-check that with all of those aspects in our community, with those who can walk at a certain pace, with those who are wheeling, with those who are ageing population, and so on. And so there's a crossover point there for myself, that we look at all of those aspects that are being considered across other countries in the world, but we make sure we think about our different population groups when we're doing that. Where we've done that already, we've found some other aspects that are important. We need to get walking routes and wheeling routes and cycling routes in first when we're making change in an area. So that's that physical change. We need to get the behaviour change embedded. And so we need to think about that first when we're looking at a physical change. We need that variety of housing that Melbourne highlighted in order to support, that feeling of living in a community and that feeling of practical support for our ageing population, leading two ways. One, a young family being supported by an older neighbour who can look after children, but they can likewise help the older person at times as well. That's community. We need a variety of housing to achieve that. But design is also important, and this comes down to the little things that mean that people will choose to leave a car at home and to feel safe and to feel that the pavements and the streets and the spaces are suited to them moving around for all population groups. And there's one final point, that reducing car travel benefits all, and just want to focus in around that about public transport. As we come out of COVID, the use of cars is likely to go up rather than back to where we were before COVID hit, because people are finding getting into a car a safer way of moving when they need to get a certain distance and can't walk it. What we need is people who own cars to be leaving them at home and to be choosing through what we design and how we deliver on 20-minute neighbourhoods, so that the use of buses goes up. If the use of buses goes up, then fares can go down, they can become more affordable for those living on low incomes, but they can also become much more reliable, and patronage can then go up even more. And we get into an upward cycle of using buses, not just that 30% that don't own a car, that we get the other 70% wanting to actually walk past their car and get on a bus when they're going further, if they're not able to walk as well. It has a positive impact on turning that story around. I thank you very much for listening. What I'm trying to give is just some context where Scotland is at the moment, my own thoughts at the end there on how we move forward with that. But we really are on a start of a journey, and I look forward to hearing what the other panellists have to say on how we move along on that journey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene. That was really helpful, really great introduction. We're getting some questions through, but I'm going to move on and introduce David Cowan, who is going to tell us a little bit more about what the Scottish Government have been doing around this area. David, are you happy to start?
Yes.
Great.
Irene's going to unshare her screen, is
yes.
she?
Thanks, Irene.
Thanks, Irene, and thanks for that introduction, which means I don't have to say an awful lot of stuff about what 20-minute neighbourhood is, which is quite helpful.
Is that unshared? Have I done it?
You have. Thanks, Irene. That's great.
Thank you.
So yeah, I'm David Cowan. I head up the regeneration unit in Scottish Government, which I like to say means I get to interfere in lots of other policy areas. So it's quite a liberty. However, it also means that a lot of things end up on my desk, and 20-minute neighbourhoods is one of those. And I guess just quickly, I mean, it was the evolution of 20-minute neighbourhoods happened quite fast in Scotland, or at least the concept coming forward as a policy idea, driven by what we've seen elsewhere. Irene talked about Melbourne and elsewhere. It's been very much a cities policy up to now, about sort of neighbourhoods in cities. So it first appeared as 20-minute cities, but in discussion, we sort of talked about what the nature of Scotland actually is. And we've only got 7 cities, and arguably a couple of those are large towns. It is predominantly a country full of towns and rural areas. So that we quickly amended it to 20-minute neighbourhoods, and arguably it could have been 20-minute places. However, that's just a wee bit of context there. I mean, ultimately, what is it? Irene's already told us. It's not a new idea, but obviously it's got new momentum, and it's a really interesting concept from my point of view, to help us advance and build on the momentum of a lot of the work that we'd already been doing in Scotland, in this territory and in this area. It's a concept that helps us bring together policies across Scottish Government that haven't necessarily naturally joined up in the past, but I think there's a really good opportunity here. But in particular, it really builds on the work that we've been doing on place and the place principle, the wellbeing economy and community wealth building, empowering communities, sustainable transport, town centres, and community-led regeneration. And I guess, the question is, why now? Well, I think there's a couple of drivers, which Irene's already touched on, but I think certainly COVID and lockdown certainly laid bare the places that we live and how important they are. And the other big driver is inclusion. And then finally, I think climate change is obviously is one that we can, 20-minute neighbourhoods, I think, helps us get to grips with. So over lockdown, people having to work from home or not work at all, you know, I think it laid bare, as I say, our local places. What are the opportunities? So the work, if we are going to start working locally, working from home more, then obviously that throws up challenges about the places that we live in and how we access those services, but also how can we access work locally. Planning and development policy, so National Planning Framework 4, for example, is increasingly focused on mixed developments and place. I've mentioned COVID, and we've seen the impact that had during lockdown, but increasingly now we're seeing the impact that COVID is having on certainly on retail, small business, and I think that's only just beginning. So I think we, regardless of where we get to with the vaccine, we have to reimagine our urban centres. Things are not going to go back to what they were. And transport, which Irene's already touched on. So Irene also mentioned the programme for government, which is a document that's published by the Scottish Government at the start of every parliamentary term, highlighting its priorities. So what did the programme for government say? It said that this crisis gives us an opportunity to radically rethink the places we live, in our homes and our communities. And we want to ensure that our communities can become vibrant hubs for the people who live there to work, shop, learn, keep active and socialise. And the programme for government also noted that for some people, the experience of lockdown showed that their lives could be improved through active travel, exercise, access to local or online services, working from home or closer to home, and access to shared green spaces. I think what it didn't say in programme for government is that for others, it showed the shortcomings of the places that they live, with limited access to services and green spaces, limited connectivity, and the need for improved infrastructure and accessibility. Within programme for government, there's a range of commitments which relate to the 20-minute neighbourhood. That's about, we've already mentioned, sort of transport and a shift away from private car use. Irene's flagged out the challenge around that. We've made commitments around active travel and announced a large amount of investment there. We've talked about the launch, or we've launched a review of the Town Centre Action Plan, and I'll talk about more about that shortly. We announced that we will establish a place-based investment programme, linking and aligning all place-based funding initiatives to ensure we have a coherent approach to effectively progress 20-minute neighbourhood ambitions, and I'll talk a bit more about that shortly as well, and the Work Local Challenge. So I'll come on to the town centres now, which is something that my team has been leading on for a number of years. The idea of the 20-minute neighbourhood aligns well with our town centre first approach in Scotland, where our work with our work on the links between planning and public health and wider policy connections has been held up as an example throughout the UK and globally. And to build on that, we were going to do a review of our Town Centre Action Plan anyway, but very much the aim of the Town Centre First principle is very much in keeping with the 20-minute neighbourhood. It's about accessible services. It's about green spaces. It's about how we design our town centres to make sure that they're places that people want to be. How can we attract local work, etc. So the 20-minute neighbourhood is a really interesting opportunity for us to really build on that. So we launched the Town Centre Action Plan review in light of where we were going to do it, let's put it this way, in light of climate change anyway, and then COVID hit. So we've now launched that review in the summertime, and we're expecting a report shortly. But again, that's been chaired by Professor Lee Sparks. It's got a membership of the review group, which is wide-ranging. And I guess one of the things that the Cabinet Secretary asked us to do in particular was to look at the sort of accessibility issues and inclusion issues. So we've got Social Inclusion Scotland working with us there, and been flagging up a number of the issues which were picked up in the poll that was sent around prior to this webinar, which is, so it's really encouraging that we are hearing those messages, and we'll look forward to seeing how the review group responds to that. And the review has also been asked to look at 20-minute neighbourhoods as part of the work that they are doing. So again, looking forward to receiving that. And then finally, I'll just touch quickly on, I mentioned place, the work that we've been doing on place in Scotland. A number of years ago, well, it wasn't a number of years ago, but we started work on place, which Irene will know, a few years ago, a wide-ranging conversation about how we built on the work that we've been doing around town centres, about how we can actually think about place, which is a nebulous concept, how we can do more to use place as a way of joining up, not just the investments and not just about how we design places, but how we join up services as well. So we had a broad conversation involving lots of people, lots of sectors, lots of organisations, and ultimately ended up in developing the place principle, which was adopted by Scottish Government and COSLA in 2019. And in essence, the place principle, let me just find the right bit of paper here. Yeah, I mean, it's about how do we work better across all sectors, and ultimately the place principle promotes a shared understanding of place and encourages a more collaborative approach to services and assets to achieve better outcomes for people and communities. So we are continuing to do work on the place principle and working across Scottish Government to engage different policy areas to bring that to life. And I guess it's what we're doing, if you like, to bring that to life and make it real for people, because as I said, it's quite a nebulous concept. 20-minute neighbourhoods helps, but we're trying to align funding programmes in Scottish Government and bring forward what we're calling the place-based investment programme. That's going to be backed by significant funding over the next 5 years, and we will announce details of how we're going to bring that forward shortly. But in essence, the intent of the programme, trying to find, I didn't do slides today, so I've got to find the right piece of paper here, so apologies. The intent of the programme is a national level. We want to look at how investments can be aligned across Scotland, how we can get better at national level about thinking how any investments that we're making, big chunky investments through schools, through health, through transport, through whatever it may be, actually thinks about the impact it has on local places and how it engages with local place plans, how it helps to deliver local aspirations, and how it can make sure that it is listening to the voices of communities before those investments are made, so that we are joined up and we are thinking these things through properly. Obviously, we can't do this alone, so we are working with COSLA, through COSLA, to have these discussions. We've prompted COSLA to have a discussion about 20-minute neighbourhoods already, and they've done so, and they broadly endorsed the concept. However, I think the rural councils in particular noted that they had some concerns about its applicability in rural areas, and I think that's absolutely right. And so I refer back to Irene's presentation. We need that flexibility. It's not a rule. It's not a hard and fast rule that 20-minute neighbourhoods, if you can't get there in 20 minutes, it's failed. It needs to be adaptable. It needs to be flexible. But ultimately, it's about how we make places better, and how we work together to make places better for the people that live there. So I'll just finish up there. I mean, ultimately, it is early stages of development, but it is building on the work that has been happening in Scotland for a number of years. It wasn't called 20-minute neighbourhoods. It was called something else. And I think I was struck. We met colleagues from Melbourne a couple of months ago via Zoom, which was great. It used to be in the olden days we would have had to get in a plane and go to Melbourne, but we now don't have to do that anymore. So perhaps that's quite good for our climate change ambitions as well. But I was struck by their approach had been starting with the concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods, and where they've got to, having run their pilots, is that it would be really good if we could use the pilots and the learning from the pilots to develop a joined up approach to delivering services and investments in places. And I guess what I took away from that, because they were very, very interested in the place principle. So what I took away from that was, in Scotland, we've come from the other way and saying, wouldn't it be good if we could start by joining up and delivering services in different ways? And that has led us to 20-minute neighbourhoods. So I look forward to hearing the other presentations today, and look forward to working with all of you really to take this forward as we learn and go in Scotland. Thank you.
That's great, David. Thanks very much. And I think that's really interesting that we should bear in mind the basis of all of this is how we make places better. If I could come now to introduce Rona Arthur, who is the interim head of service at North Ayrshire Council, and Rona's going to give us a bit of feedback about what's happening in that location. Rona.
Thanks, Emma. I've got a request. So in 10 minutes time, would you kind of wave about so that I know when to stop?
I will, no problem.
Thanks very much. Okay, good morning, everybody. I want to tell you a little bit about Ardrossan. I'm not using slides, so hopefully everybody will be able to conjure the pictures in their imagination. So Ardrossan is one of our coastal towns, and many of you will be familiar with it if you've ever been to Arran, because it's a place that you shoot through on the way to the ferry, and approximately 800,000 visitors a year pre-COVID used to rush through Ardrossan without even giving it a minute's thought. In fact, quite a lot of feedback was very negative about the town. It has considerable challenges which are extremely well documented. And as one of my staff likes to call us, top of the bottom list. It has, however, its saving grace is the most fantastic community that you could ever imagine, which have been a springboard for a whole range of community projects. We've had considerable assistance from the lottery in the Our Place project, and we've got some fantastic community leadership around about the food bank, Ardrossan Castle Heritage, our fabulous South Beach, which you may have been lucky enough to visit, and most recently our launched food systems through Whitley's Quaint Larder. So I'll just talk a little bit about the context. So the context really of this is the just this last week, I think, signed Ayrshire Growth Deal. I think it was about a week ago now, and that's really our opportunity to take forward, as Irene so well described, that physical, social and economic approach in terms of holistic placemaking. And I think for me, it is that intentionality about these policies, the fact that there is a principle first and foremost about the impact on the community, which makes this so remarkable, and it's just a delight to be involved with. So in terms of the placemaking, what we're trying to do through our Ayrshire Growth Deal is create sustainable, healthy, safe and thriving places. But for me, the key to that is the empowered community that are going to be driving this forward and living there locally. It's about destination development. It's about sustainable use of the infrastructure. And I'm thinking about things like the cycle route, for instance. But we've got wonderful assets as well, and you know, you've got the most fabulous views out across the water to Arran. You've got the castle itself. You know, lots of exciting things, and capturing that economic potential for the area. So, what we could do in terms of jobs and skills, encouraging entrepreneurship, but also social enterprise, and also capturing the local supply chain. So we're well on in terms of developing that strategic programme. A little bit ago in Ardrossan, some of you may have been familiar with the Save Our Ferry campaign, where we had the local campaign to make sure that the ferry destination came in and out of Ardrossan. That created on the back of the Our Place project, that created a real vigour about the community. We had just recently launched our locality partnerships. So that's our scheme of decentralisation, which has got a really strong balance between elected members and community leaderships and equal partnerships. So there's real parity of esteem in these. We used the place standard to start talking about what we wanted to do as a partnership roundabout place, and we were lucky enough to have some Scottish Government funding to have Charette, which is an in-depth dialogue with the community. The specific projects that make up the placemaking, and there's I think about 7 separate projects in Ardrossan, so I'm only going to talk about a couple of them. There's Ardrossan Harbour, which is a £3.5 million investment following on from the Save Our Ferry campaign, and it's involving the development of a better ferry terminal, better car parking, the marina, walkways and pathways and routes through that. And the overall project value is about 35 million, I think, and it's due to commence next year. The bit that I want to spend longest on is about Ardrossan North Shore. So this is a former refinery site. So it's contaminated land, it's laying as waste ground. It's 12.5 hectares of just kind of swampy waste ground. That's about 23.5 football pitches in sort of real money for those of you that can't do the hectares. We have secured funding from the European Regional Development Fund, the development of the national cycle route along the coast there. Remember what I was saying about the fabulous waterfront that this is. The design for round about that is electric vehicle charging points, improved public realm, the cycle path, safe walking routes, and the wider programme of investment back into that Ayrshire growth deal. So what are we going to put on these 23.5 football pitches, and how have we got to the decisions that we've got to? So we're hoping that there'll be about depending on the type of housing unit, but maybe about 300 housing units. And again, we've had discussions, particularly I'm lucky enough to work with David and Irene and many other forums as well. So again, Irene was encouraging me as well the other day to, to really push the boundaries in terms of the type of housing that goes in there, not just take what's on offer. There'll be a significant community campus, which has got both a replacement for Ardrossan Academy, but replaces a Victorian school in Winton Primary. It'll have early years, it'll have a new library, cafe, leisure facilities, including a pool, and a lot of support from our colleagues in Health and Social Care Partnership. And again, that starts to get into the deeper social problems that we have in the area. So that's that on-site support. We've got the cycling routes. There are marine and blue economy projects to the proposed international marine sort of research that's going to be on site. And again, you can see how that links back into education, how that links back into that whole employability and development of skills. So talking about how we got to that, we have a stakeholder reference group which was set up. I'm just going to quickly run through that, but I'm sure you'll be anxious to know that the key one of the key stakeholders in that is the North Ayrshire Access Panel, but it includes the school, North Shore Positive Action Group, youth organisations, Ardrossan Business, the NHS, library users, and as I say, a whole range of other partners. So a word or two about the access panel. This development is actually right adjacent to them, so they're really at the heart of this. We've worked closely with them for a number of years. I'd say we've got a well-developed relationship in terms of listening to them about developments around about the likes of the Portal, which was our leisure centre in Irvine, and the refurbishment of that the old townhouse, which is adjacent to that building. So I think we've got, pretty widely held recognition locally that their contribution, benefits a whole range of people, whether it's mums with buggies because we've listened and we've dropped pavements, we've made doors wider, to shoppers laden with bags, and older people who are maybe just not as fleet of foot as they used to be. So the Ardrossan plan, the success characteristics and the option appraisal has been checked out with the stakeholder group. We're just, I think, this week finishing the consultation. So we have not broken ground on this yet. So very much a listening process still. The consultation itself, as I say, that's unfortunately been more online than we would have liked given the current restrictions, but at the same time there are hard copies available of that. Again, you'll all be aware how very difficult consultation is at the moment. We've had online sessions as well, so Zoom meetings which have taken questions and answers, and we've had a couple of different shots at that, I suppose, and we use a tool called Fun Retro to capture what the feedback is from that, so we've always got that check back to you said we did. So kind of the key bit of the consultation that we've been working through has been about the educational benefits. the community facilities, what the Health and Social Care Partnership can bring to the deal, the Ayrshire Growth Deal investment. There's a lot about the site remediation because of the environmental interest and the sustainability of all of this. And also transport and travel, because again, the alignment of the pathways through it, the access routes for vehicles, deliveries, what we need to do about access through main roads, bus routes, all of that that needs to be taken into account. And again, it is putting ourselves in other people's shoes and working or wheeling our way through what this is actually going to look like, because having been involved with previous developments myself, I'm quite aware of how vast some of these spaces can be. So we're currently working our way through this, and as I say, we hope to complete that by the end of the week, and I'll be delighted to provide further information to anybody who's interested, or to keep you up to date as we go along.
Thanks, Rona, that's perfect. I didn't have to interrupt you at all. And great to hear that the access panels have been involved in all the work that you're doing. I'm conscious of time, and I think we've had quite a lot of chat so far. So what I'm going to propose is that we stop just now for a 10-minute comfort break, and then we'll come back to hear from Kevin, David and Morven. Thank you for the questions we've got coming in at the moment. We will get to these at the Q&A session just after the break. So if I can see you all back here at 11:30, and we'll get started again. But thanks to our speakers this morning, and we'll come back in 10 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for coming back to us. We'll just start straight away and hear now from Kevin Murray, who's a Professor of Planning at Glasgow and Dundee Universities. Kevin, can I hand over to you?
Thanks very much, Emma. Good morning, everyone, and I hope you're having an interesting session. Thanks for inviting me to join. I'm going to share screen now, if you bear with me. I just want to check that you can see that. Can I just check that my screen is shared?
That's great, Kevin, thanks.
Okay, I'm from the Academy of Urbanism in Scotland, although we're also all around the UK and Ireland and indeed internationally. I also happen to work as a planner, working with lots of communities in planning, designing and changing their communities. And I also teach students, and currently we're working on this topic. You've heard about the Scottish Government initiative and how it's now part of the programme for government, and also how, to some extent, like many other things, the COVID response has moved this ahead more quickly. But I'm showing on my screen an image of aspirations for North Berwick, where the aspiration is to squeeze the traffic down, slow it down and reduce it, make it more pedestrian friendly, and even with parts of it, remove the traffic. And the COVID pandemic response is moving forward lots of those ideas across the country. We've heard from others, including Irene at the beginning, about the background to some of this. On my screen at the moment is a couple of images from the promotion by what became the mayor of Paris, or who became the mayor of Paris, Mayor Hidalgo. The work is actually of Carlos Moreno, who's the academic from the Sorbonne behind the idea. And the sketch is showing lots of different users in a street space in what is urban Paris, and Irene pointed out similar sort of thinking in Barcelona. But these are big cities. Lots of this can happen in suburbs too. And on my screen now is an image from the Sunday Telegraph on the 20th September, picking up not only the theme from North East London, but showing that the Scottish Government is picking it up. And on that, I show that some things you'd expect under the concept to be within about 5 minutes distance, some in 10, some 15 and some 20. And a lot of this is to do with the catchment required. So obviously it's a smaller catchment for a bus stop or a corner shop, but a much bigger catchment would be required to support a library or a college or something like that. This isn't new. It isn't new in Scotland. It isn't new anywhere. And I know that's probably something you'll keep hearing about the concept. But if you think about our traditional cities and boroughs and smaller towns in Scotland, we've always had walkable towns. The pre-mechanized towns and cities, and I'm showing an old plan of Aberdeen here, but it could be Dundee or Perth, it could be Haddington or Stirling. Everything was in walking distance. Jobs, housing, specialist services, goods, storage, all sorts of things, and learning all within the same space. And what we found is that as mechanization came in the 19th and early 20th centuries, first with trains and trams and buses, and then later with cars, the whole nature of our relationship and our connections within neighbourhoods changed. I mean, lots of our neighbourhoods used to be next to the docks or the workplace or the pit or whatever. That's very different in the way that they evolved. I'm just showing some screens there about how that change happened. There's a painting there from Lowry at the top. What this meant in planning was that places tended to get zoned for use. And I'm showing an image on the left of Glasgow city centre with separated retail and office and housing, and how that is now being rethought. And that the place concept that others have talked about is more about mixed use places and neighbourhoods with different activities. And it's the same map of Glasgow, but it's part of the rethinking from segregation of our human activity to integration and mixing. And pivotal to that is the public space and the connections. And we tend to show in our images of public space, idealized spaces. And I'm currently showing one under the motorway in North Glasgow at Cowcaddens, where it's an area called the Metal Petals, where the space has been rethought. So it's a wide space, it's a safer space than it used to be, and people are walking with buggies and so on. And it's much, much better than it was. And we tend to show these idealized spaces, and they're mainly in town and city centres. The one I'm now showing is in Belmont Street in Aberdeen, and it's a very good one for people with different mobility abilities. It's got wide, flat paving on either side. The road surface here, which is currently got no vehicles, and it's a shared surfaces for a street market. It's got sets, but they're flush and they're flat. That's a good example of how things could be, but that doesn't necessarily always apply in neighbourhoods. Often they're much more challenging. I'm showing another one that's a different kind of shared surface. It's got people in it, it's got cycles, it's reasonable, and it's flush and flat, but in the middle, periodically come vehicles, white vans and the like doing deliveries. So it's great, all the activity that's here, but for people who might be unsighted or unsure on their feet or whatever, or for kids walking around, the periodic occurrence of vehicles in that kind of shared space can be difficult. And for neighbourhoods and the access to things locally, whether it's shops or cafes, the benefit comes not just from the service, but from, as I think Irene's already said this, from access to nature and importantly to play. So one of the key things, and I'm showing two images from a park here in terms of the greenery and some of the elements, it's not just the play, it's somewhere that the whole family can go. And, you know, from grandparents and parents through to children. And that's something that we've really enjoyed through the pandemic period and maybe appreciated where we have it, but recognized, as we heard from David, where we don't have it, and maybe we don't have enough play, be it in big parks or pocket parks. Now, getting to those facilities, whether they're shops, whether they're libraries or colleges or surgeries, or whether they're play spaces, the big shift in the policy is towards more walking or cycling, and certainly non-vehicle use. How do we make that work? Because that's also a challenge. And I'm showing an image on the right here of a cycle in Copenhagen, which is one of the places that's pioneered much more cycling over the last 20, 30 years. And other examples exist in Holland and Germany too. How do we do that? Well, the learning that we're getting in the academy is that we do it in stages. We don't just jump to the answer and think we've got it, because that can have impacts for people, it can have impacts for local businesses, and it can often create conflict between different users of the space and the buildings. And here we see an example on two pictures from Gothenburg, where they have car-free Sundays, and people can come in and use the central area without any vehicles and know that it's safe. But if we've got mobility and access issues, we don't want just to be able to go on a Sunday. We want to be able to go any time that we want in the year. So a lot of the rethinking, and I think it's been referenced in some of the questions, is around better access that includes cycling. And I'm showing an issue, a picture on the left of Sauchiehall Street as it was, wide 4-lane, quite intimidating. And then as it was planned on the right with new cycle lanes and planting and seating. Unfortunately, perhaps for some of us who know it well and use it, there's rather a lot of markings on what has gone in, but it's definitely an improvement. The problem is, for people with some disabilities, and including people who are just a little bit intimidated, when the cycles are using the cycle lanes very quickly, that can be frightening in terms of using the pedestrian space. So it's not straightforward, and in some ways it might have been more ideal to have the cycling on the roadside and the buffer and the planting and the seating towards the pedestrian side. And that's been raised by many disabled people I've talked to. The difficulty we've been told is that you can't plant the trees above the gullies where the drains are. That was the reason, part of the reason behind that. And the key that I referenced there is when we talk to people, and people who are doing the planning, the designing, the engineering, have to talk to people from all different backgrounds and perspectives. And for instance, not lump disabled groups into one category. We have to talk to people with different uses, different needs, different experiences, not least because they may change throughout their lives. And I'm showing some examples from our work on the Your Kirky project, where we were discussing with people their issues in different parts of the town centre and the adjoining neighbourhoods. To understand what people want, what they need, and how the neighbourhoods can be changed, we actually have to go out into the neighbourhood together. And I'm showing two images here of going out where residents and local businesses, people involved in the schools are going out with designers and explaining the issues and problems and challenges, but also the opportunities within neighbourhoods to strengthen that concept of 20-minute neighbourhood. And I'm now putting one up of an example from going up at Fir Hill and Mary Hill, where we've done it with communities there, where all the great work was being done by Scottish Canals and Sustrans, but we hadn't appreciated that actually the canal area was quite threatening and quite worrying for some people because of things that had happened in the past. So we had to work that through, and it influenced the design. And it's great to see more people walking there. But even now, when we talk to people who are out with buggies, and I've recently done it with people with buggies, they actually found the number of cyclists and the speed of cyclists actually quite threatening. So we have to find a way to mediate things like speed and shared space and respect for the different users in the spaces. I've already identified that we need to talk to and listen to different people, and I'm showing two images here, one of an older man in an electric buggy who was showing us around a neighbourhood in town centre and crossings and curbs, but he also reinforced that they still have to use, for many of them, cars at different times. So the access to and from parking areas was quite important, because often the car parks were where people felt most threatened. The image on the right is really taking advice from a wide group of people in the neighbourhood of different ages, different families, different backgrounds. And there is a gentleman there with a white stick, and he provided a lot of information. But it wasn't simply about his personal mobility, it was about his mum. He was worried about his mum, who had a heart condition, whose mobility was difficult because there were hills and so on. So he was giving intelligence that was supported by some of the other people in that room. So it's a group of people advising the designers, the planners, and the housing people. This approach, which I'm showing here an example from Royston in Glasgow, where I'm going to be going tomorrow to work with them in the next phase, is very much about learning from local people about the details, about the buildings, the spaces, and particularly for many of them, the crossings. And what we did here, the next map is showing the plotting of the problem spaces, the threatening spaces, the places that people don't like, and the other ones that they do like. So this is a mapping, detailed intelligence from a combination of walkabout together and visits. And for instance, if some members of the community couldn't go on the walkabout or the visit because of the hills and so on, one of their family would come and we'd meet them afterwards and we'd confirm the issues with them. And this can influence the approach and the design. This is what we're going to be working on tomorrow in Royston Road. And we already know that people are saying, this is very nice, it slows the traffic and so on down. But if a 15 or 20-minute neighbourhood's going to work, we need a crossing in there. Otherwise, we'll be standing waiting to cross forever. So things like crossings, connections, curbs, width of pavements are all part of making the 20-minute neighbourhood work, so that people can get an access to a bus stop or a shop or some other local service. By doing that work together, it's possible to produce a detailed plan, and others have mentioned the local place plans, which are now coming along in Scotland as a very welcome community-related initiative. This one shows the work we did in Prestwick. It shows different themes of the plan. Some of them were around heritage, some were around gardening, and quite a number were around making it a safer, more comfortable, dementia-friendly place, working with the dementia-friendly group in Prestwick. And different plans have been progressed. Some of them have started, others are ongoing. But I don't want to presume it's easy. I'm showing now another image of the Royston neighbourhood and a hill. When we finished the initial plan for Royston, and we were very pleased, we got lots of ideas and lots of projects out of it. At the end of the meeting, a woman stood up and she said to me, but I'm worried about the bins. And I thought, oh, is it a nuisance? Are the bins blowing down the hill? She said, no, it's the bins at the bus stop. And I thought, oh, is that a litter issue? I'm trying to think, what do we have to do here? And she said, they've taken away the bins at the bus stop. And I said, what's the problem? She said, I need that bin to lean on. I've got a heart condition. I struggle in this hill. And if I can't get a bus, I can't get to the hospital. I can't visit my sister. I can't visit the shops. If we don't have the bus stop and the bins, I'm completely isolated. And that showed that often our professional and policy view of things is very different from the lived experience of people. So I think we've got to take on that detail. We've got to talk to people. We've got to listen. And the 20-minute neighbourhood's a great opportunity. And on my screen, I'm just listing some of the great potential. We can make neighbourhoods more livable. We can help increase local choice for shops and services, and even hopefully to workspace. But we have to go about it in an inclusive manner in terms of age and ability and mobility. And as others have said, we've got to link in the suburbs, the lower density suburbs, and the rural areas into this. Walking and cycling is a key part of the driver for the government, but it's not the only one. I think we can also help people feel more connected to their place and their neighbours and their local sense of identity. But finally, we've also got to look at the density and the mix if this is all going to work. We've got to look at housing and how it's provided and allocated in Scotland. So looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks, Kevin. That was really helpful and really interesting to hear about all the work you've been doing in terms of consultation, which I'm sure all of our members are really interested to hear more about. Thank you. If I can come very quickly on to David Hunter now from Max. David, do you mind just taking us very quickly through what impact there has been on disabled people?
Sure. Can you see and hear me okay?
I think if Kevin can stop sharing his screen and you can maybe switch over if that's possible. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So I think disabled people quite often get a bit nervous when they hear about an apparently new idea about transport or managing streets, like, for example, low traffic neighbourhoods or spaces for people. Often with good reason, because the mobility needs of disabled people too often seem to be thought about as a secondary factor once the big decisions have already been made. So it's very welcome that an event like this one can open up discussion about 20-minute neighbourhoods right at the start, when we're still all trying to understand exactly what it might mean in practice. It's essential that access and inclusion are thought about at the outset. So we've already heard a bit about what a 20-minute neighbourhood is. I like to really think of it as a place where most of your daily needs are pretty much on your doorstep, a short walk or wheel away. So how big might a 20-minute neighbourhood be? I'm quite nervous that sometimes I'd hear the concept described as everything within a 20-minute walk, wheel or cycle. Because if we're talking about cycling, that could be 4 or 5 miles away, hardly on your doorstep. So I like to think of it as kind of, in principle at least, a reasonably slow walk, say within 1 kilometre of everyone's home. I think there are 2 really big opportunities for this idea, in theory at least, to make better places for people to live, better places for everyone, but especially for disabled people. And those are access to local services and a better and greater sense of community and neighbourliness. So in terms of access to services, what kind of services might you expect to have in your 20-minute neighbourhood? As we've already heard, everywhere is different and it won't be the same everywhere, but there will be some shops. Certainly a corner shop, perhaps underrated community facility, perhaps a chemist, maybe a post office and a small supermarket. There'll be some healthcare, hopefully, perhaps opticians, health centre, dentist, but almost certainly not a hospital. Education, probably a primary school might be realistic, but again, probably not a secondary school with the catchment areas. Leisure and community space, as we've heard, green spaces, play parks for children, bars, cafes, a meeting space venue, particularly important perhaps in rural communities, maybe a library, perhaps not a swimming pool. Other facilities, obviously, churches, other places of worship, police station, quite unlikely, I'd think now. And a key question, which has been touched on several times, I'll just leave hanging, about jobs. Will jobs be local? So in terms of the community benefit, I think mixed, diverse communities where everything on your doorstep must be a great aspiration. And when I say diverse, I'm particularly thinking about age, as I think Irene mentioned earlier. So not only can you physically access services, but you meet your neighbours. As you get older, you may be able to retain your independence longer. You may be able to stay in your home rather than move into a care home, away from places you know and people you know. And care homes themselves should be in the local communities, not ghettos removed from normal life. But how do we decide what services should be on the doorstep, and who decides? We need to involve people in this discussion, and a theme emerging today is clearly that must involve disabled people. There will certainly be differences for urban and rural areas. I think there will also be differences if we're planning a new development or housing facility, or trying to apply the concept to an existing community. But wherever it is and however it works, we need to make changes to neighbourhoods. Many neighbourhoods simply don't work. And I'm particularly keen to emphasise the importance of the bread and butter pedestrian environment. We want ideally less traffic and slow traffic. We need to be able to cross the road easily, as Kevin was pointing out. We need smooth, wide pavements free of clutter. We need drop curbs or raised pavements. We need simple things like somewhere to sit or lean against, and toilets. And I know that many of these issues came out quite strongly in the survey which Disability Equality Scotland recently did, and I expect Morven will talk more about that in a moment. But we'll also need other transport to get out of the neighbourhood, again, as everyone has said, to work, to school, to college, to hospital, and we'll need to do this on a daily basis. So we'll need other ways to get out and about. There will almost certainly be a need for more cycling facilities. Public transport will be crucial. And critically, I think, another point I'd just like to emphasise is that many people will still need their cars. So there are over 60,000 motability cars in Scotland and nearly 200,000 people in Scotland entitled to a motability car. So not every car user has the same opportunity to use other modes like cycling and walking. And I think this is really too often overlooked in many sustainable travel programmes and must be thought about carefully at the outset. So finally, just moving to a couple of thoughts about where life is after the coronavirus pandemic, hopefully not too long. There will be some changes which I think we're still grappling with. It looks likely there will be more home working and remote working, which probably means less peak time traffic. But on the other hand, internet shopping will probably mean more off-street, off-peak traffic. And we're still wondering what the effect on high streets, including neighbourhood high streets, will be. And we're still wondering if public transport will return to normal. So finally, I think there are some questions about, even if we all agree that this is a great idea, how will we achieve them? How will we achieve them? Do we have the right policy levers to make them happen? And are we willing to use them? We don't seem very keen in using many existing powers, such as to control speed limits or obstructing pavements by parking on them, for example. So the two obvious areas seem to me to be planning policy and financial incentives, taxes, incentives, business rates, etc. But however we achieve them, the key must be to involve everyone in decisions about their communities. Max will be advising Scottish Government to make this happen. And so events like today and the DES survey are invaluable. And I particularly look forward to hearing questions from disabled people in the next session. Thanks.
Thanks very much, David. Morven, can I ask you very quickly just to summarise some of the stuff that came out of our poll, and then we can lead into some of the questions. I think it'll tie in quite nicely, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely, not a problem at all. So each week we run a weekly poll with our members, and in early November we ran a poll with over 450 responses. asking the question, can you access key services in your local community within a 20-minute walk or wheel from where you live? Unsurprisingly, 94% of those respondents answered no, and only 6% said yes, they could. The main issues coming from the weekly poll itself were around pavement infrastructure, people not being able to access key services within a walking and wheeling distance on a practical level due to the inaccessible nature of the built and natural environment around them. And there were also concerns around poor pavement infrastructure, around the lack of dropped curbs and safe crossing places. The pavement obstructions also posed a problem around A-boards, bollards, wheelie bins, cafe furniture, and this would force wheelchair and scooter users visually impaired and people with pushchairs onto the road and into the path of oncoming traffic. Pavement parking was also an issue, again causing an obstruction. As everybody may know, that Scotland recently became the first UK country to introduce a pavement parking ban, which will be introduced next year. Public transport was also an issue to accessing key services in the local communities. This included travel to medical appointments, which can be challenging by the accessibility of the route to the bus stop and the frequency of the services. And the availability of key services was also identified, such as banks, building societies and post offices that are closing down in town centres across the country. Some disabled people reported that health and social care is being delivered at larger healthcare facilities and centralised locations rather than in the local community. Green spaces was also an element of issue due to not having the availability or access to safe and accessible green spaces where they live. And rural communities also came up as an issue, recognising that 20-minute neighbourhoods wouldn't be possible, but we have heard from panellists around the flexibility in that planning there too. Most importantly, what came out is, and is encouraging to hear from the other speakers today as well, around the engagement with disabled people. And our advice would obviously continue to do that more so, and especially with access panels. We do have an access panel network across Scotland who do provide that support and advice and guidance in those areas. So I'm conscious of time. That is just a quick run through of the weekly poll results that we posed for the 20-minute neighbourhood. I'm aware that a lot of the issues are coming up in the questions that we've got, so I'll allow extra time just to go through those questions just now. Thanks.
Thanks, Marvin, that's great. Yeah, I think the points that came out of our poll are really quite telling, in that the infrastructure question was very important for people. Until we can get the basics right and get people to use the pavements outside their front doors, it's difficult to imagine how we can get a 20-minute neighbourhood functioning. But could I ask the panel then, first of all, what can be done to ensure that planners and developers understand accessibility and bear that in mind when they're planning for a concept like 20-minute neighbourhoods? Who would like to take that? Kevin, can I come to you? Yeah, please do.
I think the first thing is to encourage developers and their advisors, because they've often got designers and planners working with them, to go and talk to, but I would say listen to primarily the groups, because sometimes when the consultation process, maybe before a planning application goes in, people go and talk to groups and explain what they want to do, but they don't hear what the group's experiences and the knowledge. So what I implied in my presentation, there's a lot of local intelligence in some of these groups built up over many years. They know the neighbourhood, they know issues about junctions, crossing, flooding, all sorts of things that incoming developers and investors and house builders might not know. So tap into, listen, and actually help explain where you're picking up and changing the schemes as a result, because that will also help a community and representatives understand where their issues are being heard and picked up. And occasionally it might be difficult to do something that's a request. So I would say talk to them, but before the design's finished, before a planning application is made, don't go afterwards.
Great, thank you. Did anybody else on the panel want to come in at this stage? Okay, we'll move on then. So again, some of things that came out of our poll, I think Linda's mentioned that there was a particular quote that said, sometimes think disabled people have been overlooked, but they're not, they are deliberately ignored. And if a neighbourhood is going to be for everyone, then disabled people have to be involved in the design. And I think that's coming across quite strongly from what we've heard today. But how do we get that message across regarding how important that meaningful engagement is? What kind of things have we done before? Rona, you said you worked with the Access panel. How did that work for you?
Yeah, very well. As I say, we've been really fortunate and that relationship's been built over a number of years. So, for instance, when we were building Irvine, you know, it was about thinking about how we could get access into the building, given that, you know, quite often you're not dealing with new builds, you're not dealing with flat ground. So it's about what's dignified and what's suitable. And at the end of the day, they ended up with access that they could work with into a pool which was much better equipped than anything they'd previously had at the much loved Magnum. And again, you'll know that there was a lot of controversy over the actual rebuild of that. But at the same time, you know, in terms of giving everybody fair and equal access and the facilities, there was something there which was a really good news story. Equally, we've had long discussions over things like, and I see somebody, sorry, I forget your name, was talking about changing places. You know, particularly I've also got responsibility for Eglinton Country Park and a lot of the other locality partnership working. So again, it's listening to what people need to change about places. And then again, I know it's crabby, but it is the old local government thing about we don't always have the money that we can do what we would like to do in the first instance. So it's about how we work together to try and find the right kinds of solutions which make life easier for people and give people a bit of respect. But as I was trying to say, I think a lot of the changes benefit everybody in society. So it's not just about you know, ability or disability. It's about sensible planning and making places nice for people. So, for instance, Kevin, I think that I'm sure I read in one of the papers that they're looking at a separate pedestrian route around that cycle path. So we're not talking about a shared space between a cycle route and a pedestrian route. So it's a recognition that actually I'm terrified of cyclists whizzing past me. I have a fear of being hit from behind, you know. So I think it is all of these things, and it's just working through what we can do with the land and the resources we've got. I don't know if that really answers the question, and to whoever contacted me, please just get in touch.
Great, thanks, Rona, that's helpful. I have got another question linked to this from Hussein, which is around 20-minute neighbourhoods are made up of far more than just physical infrastructure. They're more than just what's available and how to get there. And this obviously is very true of people with visual impairments and other disabilities. But can I ask the panel then, what considerations have been made to ensure as much information about the neighbourhood and who gets the most from it are provided and that it's accessible for everyone? Who would like to respond?
I could come in on that.
Thanks, Irene.
So I think that's where I ended what I was talking about, is that we need to be clear and not getting too obsessed on the characteristics of a 20-minute neighbourhood, that it has to have, you know, local shops and this and that. It has to have those things, and to think about all of the population groups, and that is how you achieve that. And I would come back to exactly what Kevin has said. This is about lived experience. It's about frontline staff who work with those with lived experience as well, and making sure that you think about those. Now, that can be a challenge to stop and have that thought process. And I think that's why, as we start the journey on 20-minute neighbourhoods, we need to be clear that if you're sitting thinking, okay, how do we deliver this? You immediately think, oh, right, there are the elements of a 20-minute neighbourhood and there are different population groups, and that you're doing the two.
Thank you, Irene, that's great. If I can pick up on the idea of shared spaces, it's come up a bit in the chat and in different presentations this morning. How do shared spaces work in the kind of concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods? We're hearing about, Kevin, you mentioned your presentation about flush and flat. There's been some comments in the chat maybe about how that's not so great for people with visual impairments. We're also hearing about the rise of electric vehicles, obviously being much quieter has an impact for those who have hearing impairments. What kind of considerations are being made for these changes in how we live in terms of design for 20-minute neighbourhoods?
Shall I start and then maybe others pick up?
Great. Yes,
I totally agree with the comment made about the curb, which is why I showed the Aberdeen Belmont Street one, which I think is a good one. And the other flush one, if it's a shared surface, it clearly has problems. So particularly if you add not only the individuals, but also if people have got guide dogs, that's an issue as well. So the flush surface works if it's not a mixed shared surface, if it's pedestrians and wheelers and everyone knows that they're in a safe place. But the use of visual and level clues like curbs and dropped curbs and so on, that's important for people. So I totally agree with the point. I think the difficulty this year is that in many places there are temporary fencing, kind of plastic fencing to widen the footways outside. Sometimes it's a supermarket or wherever, where people have had to queue to go in shops in a kind of COVID context. And it does make some of the streets, the high streets, the neighbourhood streets look messy at the moment, but it's temporary and it's a public health approach. Nobody's saying it's the right thing as a design. And I think we just got to be a little bit tolerant of our engineering and planning colleagues who are trying to respond to that. Because I know some people have said, oh, it spoils the look of the high street or the local street. But it's not a design response. They're trying to make it safer. It's a public health measure. And I think we've got to see it as such. So hopefully, maybe in time, some of those could become widened pavements that are safe and flush. I don't mean flush into the road, but they're safe on that side. Where there are allegedly shared mixed surfaces, having at least a clear lane that's pedestrian and wheeler only, that doesn't have any vehicles at all, is absolutely pivotal in terms of the current thinking. And that's come from the advice and the guidance of people with different disabilities themselves.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Anyone else want to pick up on anything that Kevin said there?
I'll come in. On that topic around shared spaces and then actually not having any cars at all, I think what's important in this, and I saw it coming up in some of the questions, is this is about reducing our reliance on the car, but it's a reliance on the car for those who don't need to use it. It's absolutely not about reducing that reliance for those that need it in order to get access. So where we would look at completely closing off a street, we are looking at the population groups and still looking at the need to have access through from car parks, as Kevin raised, from car parks through to these areas where there's no longer going to be cars going through. And the ultimate aim there is that those car parks will be accessible, will be more pleasant, because we'll have stopped those that don't need to get into a car to get there from blocking them up. So it will be improving that overall experience for those who do need a car.
Great, thank you, Irene. I think that kind of links us on quite nicely to the topic of transport, which is coming out quite strongly from the comments and the questions today. Obviously, there are areas just now, we hear it all the time from our members about inaccessible transport, whether that's physically being able to access a bus or a train, but also just the frequency of services in some rural areas as well. How can we bear that in mind in terms of planning for a 20-minute neighbourhood if those basic infrastructures aren't in place with transport? What is the things that we need to consider?
Yeah, I mean, I'll maybe come in, not specifically on transport, but I guess on the more general point. I mean, there's lots of places that have been working in this space already. So I think that's what we should start off by saying, is that, you know, there's a lot of people have been grappling with this stuff. And a lot of these issues around transport and stuff we already know. That's not answering the question. But I think the commitment for 20-minute neighbourhoods in the programme for government kind of, I think, is asking everybody to up their game, and not least Scottish Government and some of these this stuff. So yes, there's difficult questions there. I think that's the first thing I would flag up, is that 20-minute neighbourhood is a great concept, but it's going to throw up some really difficult challenges for how we think about policy and public transport, community transport. I think these things are all really important, but I guess for me at least, the experience of working in regeneration, towns, whether that be town centres or around disadvantaged neighbourhoods or fragile rural, where it works best is when there's a shared ambition for a place, and it's not being imposed. It's everybody's kind of on board, so that the public sector, the community itself, and that's in its broadest sense, not just the loudest voices, where the private sector, which is part of the community, is also engaged and behind it, and everyone's kind of pointing in the same direction. And that's sort of on a bigger scale. But then you work backwards and say, well, what does that actually mean for how we actually implement this? So it's not just tanking ahead and saying we've done it. It's a 20-minute neighbourhood. It's making sure that before you get there, you've actually engaged the people that live there, that run their businesses there, that might move there in the future, so that they understand what the offer is, but also so they can shape it and influence it. So it has to be shared, I think, at the starting point. And then once you've set out what you want to achieve, then I think that's kind of what we're focusing on, why place is really important, because you can make decisions about how we shape things around these places, which are much more meaningful and much more impactful, and will have an impact on improving people's lives. If you try to do that at a regional level or a national level, there are things that should be done on a regional, national level, but if you start to make these decisions at the wrong level, that is when the wrong things happen. So I guess I would say that it's really making sure that you've got that shared ambition, and that everybody has a chance to shape that shared ambition as your starting point, and then the difficult questions maybe flow but are easier to answer at a local level. So
Emma, perhaps I could just come in particularly on transport. I think, to be honest, we really need some very candid discussions about public transport, particularly how long the impacts of the pandemic will be. Bus travel has been basically falling through the floor in Scotland for decades, and this is going to accelerate it. Many rural bus services were marginally profitable, and I think fewer will be profitable in the future. So there's been a huge amount of money supporting bus and train services during the pandemic, and I think there's a very challenging reimagining of what public transport might be. Possibly it could involve more demand responsive transport, community transport, maybe door-to-door taxi services, but this will all require public money, particularly in rural areas. Just a couple of other points, if I could. I think there was a question about a bus in Aberdeenshire that is not wheelchair accessible. That should be illegal under the Equality Act. And I just wanted to make the other point, referring to sort of how we ensure disabled people are involved, as well as adopting some of the good practice, which I think we've heard about here. I think we also need strong advocacy from groups like DES and others. And we also need to be quite clear that the equality law and statutory obligations on equality are enforced properly, because it seems to me quite clear that too often, whether it's doing equality impact assessments or simply considering how services impact disabled people, it's simply not done good enough.
Absolutely. Thanks, David. Interesting I'll pick up on the kind of rural aspect. There's been a few comments that came through our poll on this topic as well. If I can ask the panel, how can we kind of implement a 20-minute neighbourhood concept in a rural or an island community where there's obviously differences between urban environments, and where there may already be a kind of lack of neighbourhood, if you like, in terms of services that are available? Who would like to take the rural question?
I'll come in because I'm really interested in this, and it's something I'm intending to do more work around and to go in and work more locally, because we've on so many occasions only learn by going in and doing and being brave enough to actually do that. But I think the local aspect reflects the fact that what I started with, every place is different. So we need to look at rural areas and we need to see what that contribution can be, because no, it will not be the same contribution as somebody living in on the edge of a small town in the central belt of Scotland. But that isn't to say that having that conversation, building relationships with those with lived experience of what is happening when they live there, and then joining that up with those frontline staff, those that can move in and can work in a kind of a partnership on changing that, can improve that ability to live locally and to get access to what services are there, to focus them into seeing a 20-minute neighbourhood as being the nearest town centre or village centre, and to increasing therefore the use of that centre, and therefore helping more businesses to thrive there. How could we do that? Every area will be different, but there's also an ability there to take all those local differences and build that up into a collective of change. But there's not one answer. 20-minute neighbourhoods isn't the one answer for all of Scotland. It's a kind of a guiding thing for us to go in and work in every community to see how we help with more local living.
Great, thank you. Kevin, do you want to come in on this point? Kevin, you're still on mute. So.
Sorry, I'm muted. I think to reinforce Irene's point that one, it's not one size fits all. Two, rural areas are different, and it's not just a living bit. Some of our rural villages and towns, you could easily walk or cycle or be in a buggy or whatever it is, but the businesses that you have in those places often have a much bigger catchment. So that they depend on people coming from much further afield. I mean, I bizarrely first learned about this in Aberdeen when we were working in Aberdeen city centre, and a lot of the businesses in Aberdeen city centre depended on people, what they called country folk, coming in from Aberdeenshire and beyond, Murray and so on, to use their shops and services. In a smaller place like Dumfries or Newton Stewart or somewhere like that, the same may apply. You may need people coming from 30 or 40 miles away. So we have to think about it differently, but we still need to make the core as walkable, as comfortable for different abilities and mobilities for local people. So it's not an either or, but it doesn't mean you just make it all car based. You still got to make it comfortable for people getting around by different modes within the normal regular town, maybe without those external visitors and tourists and so on.
Thanks, Kevin. That's great. Any other comments from the panel?
I mean, I'll come in on that. I mean, it's one of the things that's been flagged up, obviously, early doors. There's a couple of things that have been pointed out to us with the concept of neighbourhoods, and we're all ears really. So some people are saying it feels like it could just be a sort of a nice middle class thing, and how does this actually apply to disadvantaged communities? And we actually need to take that one and really think it through and make sure that's not what's going to happen here. Likewise with rural communities, and I guess for me that's why if the number 20 of 20 minutes, it could be 17 and a half, it might be 32. Yeah. We need to make sure that it's the concept that we're thinking about here, but rather than exactly how many minutes it takes. But I think the other thing is to think about, we have to be creative about solutions here, about services and the like, but also we need to start changing how we think about this stuff. And that's the whole challenge that 20-minute neighbourhoods throws up. Yeah. So I chair a panel looking at regeneration investment. We see a lot of stuff coming from rural communities that are themselves trying to find solutions to how the services are delivered. So whether that be, creating community facilities where they can invite services in to be delivered from there, whether they're trying to create spaces for social enterprises rather than private sector businesses. But one that struck me was one in the Borders this time around, who come in, and the local shop, the couple who've run it for the past X number of years, were getting old and wanted to retire. And suddenly you've got no local shop, which means people then suddenly have to travel far away to do it. So actually, the community had come together and said, let's create a community shop. Let's keep the service here. It also keeps the post office, and it keeps a bank and stuff like that, or not a bank, but a bank machine. So it's about not letting. It's about not being complacent and letting these things drift. We have to be much more proactive and get behind these things and find other ways to make these things happen in rural areas, which will be quite different, obviously, than in urban areas. Although the impact of COVID is going to make us have to be just as creative, I think, in urban areas as well.
Can I come in and just follow in from David on that as well? Because obviously North Ayrshire has a number of towns in it, but it's also got 2 islands and considerable rurality as well. So I just think, and David knows this as well, is that I just think there's a balance for the messaging of this about what the expectation from the public's perspective is of a 20-minute neighbourhood, because I'm afraid that for many of them, they just think that means that all the traditional services will be reopened within their local community, the banks, the post offices, the libraries and so on. And, you know, it's a different message that we're talking about. It's about moving around. It's about creating the heart of a community. It's about good transport routes rather than an introduction or a reintroduction of traditional models, because that's not something at this stage which probably local and Scottish government can afford. And I think we just have to face that one up, because we have had a very traumatic year, a very expensive public health emergency, and we all know that there's an economic pressure which will follow swiftly from that, and that it's very likely that national and local government will be trying very hard jobs to manage that. I think if we have the right dialogues with our communities, that means that we can still move forward with these policies, because essentially listening to people with that lived experience is going to help us to use those infrastructure projects in a way which we've maybe not been as I don't know, as open and transparent perhaps about these kind of dialogues with communities. So I think we're in a better place, but I think that we just need to be careful about how people perceive what we're all meaning when we're talking about placemaking. And I know that, you know, we set the right context at the beginning of this discussion, and everybody in this room's okay, but it's about how you influence people when you're out and about speaking about placemaking.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Rona. Now there is one specific question that's popped up about the kind of North Ayrshire location. If I could ask Rona about the improvements in Ardrossan. Hilary's asking whether investment in one town is depriving other towns and villages of investment, giving the example of Arran, which is lacking some facilities, such as she's giving an example of a public swimming pool. The council has closed all the public loos. It doesn't maintain some of the public realm spaces. Is there a concern there that investment for 20-minute neighbourhoods maybe impacts on other local areas?
No, I don't think so. I think you know, we've got a whole range of capital projects. So you know, it's one that, because we do work with 33 elected members who are all ward based and have very focused, you know, a very tight focus on place, and work very hard to make sure that they get a balance. And you know, to mention some of the specific things about Arran and the pool, for instance. No, we don't have our own pool there, but the council pays for access. You know, at one of the local pools in a hospitality complex. We've invested in the ferry terminal, and there's still work and projects which are ongoing. And I think it's all about understanding that we have to work our way through I guess the pressures and the needs of each project. So for instance, the part of the Ardrossan project, the way that these came together, where we had the Ayrshire Growth Deal coming, we had the Save Our Ferry and the whole refurbishment of the harbour that came in the back of that. The campus project comes principally from the extreme pressure to replace Ardrossan Academy, which was the school which was rated the poorest in Scotland in terms of its physical condition, as opposed to Arran, which has a beautiful PFI building, which was, it's one of the most beautiful schools I think that I've ever had the privilege to be in, with outstanding accommodation.
Thank you, Rona, that's great. Now, I do have a question here about the kind of planning system. Is there any suggestion that the planning system will become more prescriptive and proactive to match the ambition of a 20-minute neighbourhood, giving the example of preventing things like out-of-town shopping centres? Anybody want to come in about the...
Can I come in on that?
Yes, of course. Thanks.
I mean, I guess the National Planning Framework 4 position statement was published last week, and it was quite firm on supporting 20-minute neighbourhoods and the sort of stuff we're talking about, place and town centres. Obviously, the National Planning Framework 4 has to go through Parliament and be agreed, and it won't come into force for a couple of years. But yes, the intent is to be much stronger about 20-minute neighbourhoods. How much appetite there'll be for out of town is an interesting question, and that's something that's come up in the review of the Town Centre Action Plan. That's been discussed fairly widely, and are the things that we need to stop doing if we're going to deliver 20-minute neighbourhoods, and not just deliver 20-minute neighbourhoods, but address the climate challenge that we have, and things like that as well. It'd be interesting to see if the review group actually does make the recommendation that there should be a moratorium on out of town, and then obviously see what the reaction is there. But what I will say is that these things on the face of it look quite attractive, and certainly I think that's something that we should be exploring. But there's other folk who might have different views, I think, not least the business community. So I think there's opportunities to look at that. Are we there yet? Probably not. But do we need to be? I think we need to look really hard at it and make some tough decisions, as I've said before. So.
Thanks, David. I suppose that one of the other key questions around 20-minute neighbourhoods is who is responsible for driving these forward, and who's going to pay for it. There was suggestion in the question and answer section here about investing in 20-minute neighbourhoods, and even in a small scale sense. And Doherty's suggesting that, and David Hunter, you mentioned this in your own presentation about the need for things like benches, toilets to be in place to let people actually use their local area. Is there funding for small changes like that within the 20-minute neighbourhood framework, and who's responsible for it?
I'll go first, just because government always gets asked about funding, I guess. There's a couple of answers to that. I mean, one is that it's kind of, in my view, it's kind of got to be everyone's responsibility, and so there's not a simple answer to funding. However, having said that, we did run a program a couple of years ago called Stalled Spaces, which we ran sort of as a legacy of the Commonwealth Games with planning colleagues and with Architecture and Design Scotland. It was quite successful. So I think there might be some scope in revisiting that, supporting communities to make small scale changes that are being described. Like it could be benches, it could be, taking a space and turning it into, something nice that's otherwise antisocial. So I think there's opportunities there. I did mention that we've got a sum of money attached to what we're calling the place-based investment program, and it's not the be all and end all, because we want to influence all budgets, if you like. But we are exploring opportunities for that, and whether we can make some of that available for the type of stuff being discussed, or whether we can talk to local authorities about how we can do that together. I think that would be something we could take forward.
Fantastic, thank you, David. We've had loads of questions today, and I'm conscious of time, so I just wanted to ask one final question of the panel, which is, if there is one thing that an organisation such as Disability Equality Scotland can do with a membership and with access to the Access Panel network, is there anything specific that we should be bearing in mind to support or influence the progress of 20-minute neighbourhoods? What is something that we would be usefully able to do?
Well, I guess for my purposes, I mean, I've found this really, really helpful and a really, really useful session. Ultimately, these things need to be teased out very much, as I said before, at a local level when you're developing plans for what you're trying to do. But I think Disability Equality Scotland just needs to keep raising these issues, actually, and not shy away from them. I guess the other thing I would say is that some of these issues are specific to disabled people, but others have a broader impact. And how do we link these aspirations to things that also link to some of the town centre work or climate change, etc. So there's some things that are specific, and some things that actually it's a wider momentum building piece. So I think let's just keep the conversation going. I think certainly I won't be progressing national thinking about 20-minute neighbourhoods without involving Disability Scotland going forward. So,
fantastic. That's great to hear. Thank you. Thank you for everybody's time this morning. I'm conscious that we could talk about this for all morning, but we'll close our session today. Thank you for everybody's questions. We will make sure that the panel gets sight of these, and we'll circulate responses after today's event. So just finally, thank you to everybody on our panel today. I hope you found that an interesting, informative discussion, and we will see you all again soon at our next webinar. Thanks, everybody.